Is political correctness killing comedy? Hello and welcome. I'm Marc Sidwell, and this is Counterculture, the cultural discussion show that laughs in the face of censorship. Today we're discussing the state of comedy. With university campuses increasingly dominated by speech codes, and with the BBC still dominated by a left-wing culture, is talent being frozen out? And how hard is it for anyone to be really funny in a culture of perpetual offence? Joining me today to discuss all of this is a multi-talented panel. First of all, we have Rafe Heydel-Mankoo of the New Culture Forum, who's also a historian and commentator. And we have three brilliant stand-up comedians. We have Simon Evans, who's known for his Radio 4 show, Simon Evans Goes to Market, and who's touring a new show around the country now. We have Konstantin Kisin, who's also the co-host of the free speech podcast and YouTube show Triggernometry. And we have Dominic Frisby, songwriter and author, best known to Brexiteers for his anthem 17 Million Fuck Offs. Thank you all for joining me so much. Now let's start with the big picture. Is it true to say now that comedy is in a bit of a rut, in the mainstream at least? I mean, obviously there's lots of talent around this table, but is mainstream comedy not as good as it used to be at the moment? I mean, Rafe, what's your feeling? Have we lost the fire somewhere?
Well, yes, absolutely. I mean, I would say that, I've often said if I was to go on Mastermind, my subject would be British comedy in the 20th century, because every decade I found comedy that I found engaging and amusing and which pushed boundaries for its time. But there was a transformation that occurred in the 80s, and we're living through that era now, of alternative comedy. It's Alexei Sayle, really, who started all this with the Comedy Store, who brought in this political element to humour, where, let's be honest about it, a Marxist element to humour. And so comedians now, if you're not on side, and if you're not seen to be punching down, you'll be basically unable to get any shows going, despite the fact that the public at large enjoy that sort of comedy. And there's a huge disconnect now between those who make comedy on the BBC and those people who actually want to enjoy comedy and go to YouTube to find other people who are supplying that. So yes, there's good comedy out there, but it's not being provided on the main platforms of mainstream television.
I mean, do the professionals agree? I mean, Simon, does that chime with some of your experience?
Well, I made a programme for Radio 4, which went out last September, looking at this, and I think it's slightly more nuanced, perhaps, than Rafe has suggested, but there's a grain of truth to it. Alexei Sayle, to take that as a kicking off point, certainly did initiate a revolution in stand-up comedy and the Comedy Store in the 1979 or whatever it was, the first few years. There was an eruption of, I guess, student politics, but it wasn't like demanding, it wasn't like actually advocating Marxism so much as kind of, it was aware of Marxism, it was kind of steeped in it, but it was self-deprecating about it, and it understood that it wasn't, you know, he was mocking it, and he was mocking his own pretensions and his own understanding of it, and at the same time, you know, his kind of frustrations as a fat little half-Jewish scouser in a tight suit, you know, he knew he was an absurd figure. He wasn't like Jeremy Corbyn, kind of earnestly preaching to you about the need to redistribute wealth. But there has been a kind of presumption in the last 30. I think it simmered for a long time. It has actually erupted with Brexit. It's been quite interesting. Just to give a really bizarre analogy, I flew to Aspen, Colorado, a ski resort, about 15 years ago to do a comedy festival there. But on arrival in Aspen, which is at 8,000 feet, a tooth abscess, which had been dormant for God knows how many years, suddenly erupted due to the change in atmospheric pressure, and I was in agony and had to go and see a dentist. Luckily I had travel insurance. I think Brexit's been a bit like that. Something has been dormant for many years in the comedy industry and the comedy community, which nobody had really examined or noticed, and suddenly this kind of eruption and this kind of drawing of lines and parameters and whose side are you on mentality expose the degree to which an extraordinarily unbalanced distribution of views had gradually taken place. And so whether it's not exactly left wing or right wing, that kind of somewhere everywhere kind of dynamic, which, you know, people have discussed, is more to do with it. But comedy was suddenly exposed as really only being Remainers and a handful of people who were Brexit, or even a little bit sceptical or willing to admit they didn't quite get it, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And that, I think, has created a sense, which you quite rightly say, that now 50% of the country don't really feel like they're getting their meat. And this is creating problems for the BBC, who are having to justify a licence fee, and yet, you know, are not actually serving half the public.
Well, I mean, Dominic, as someone who's made Brexit at the heart of your comedy, how do you find it?
Well, there's a lot of different things going on, and it's, as Simon says, it's very nuanced, and you can't say that comedy is not as good as it was. One observation I'd make is there's no one today who is as big and as known in the public eye as Ronnie Barker or Morecambe and Wise or Tommy Cooper, or one of the greats of the 70s or the early 80s. But one reason for that is that there was only 1, 2 or 3 channels at that time. So everybody's eyes focused on that thing. There's so much more proliferation of media. It's sort of harder to become that known mainstream person. But I do think there's something very wrong at the BBC. And it's every channel's dream to have a hit comedy show that they can export around the world, because it will make that channel's fortune and it will keep that channel afloat for years and years and years. Every production company's trying to land the hit, and money is being thrown at comedy left, right and centre. And if you look at the money that gets invested and then you look at the actual output, something's very wrong, because there's so little really, really good stuff. And the really good TV series, the really successful ones, seem to slip through by accident. They slip through in spite of the system, not because of the system. And so, for example, you have something like The Office, which the commissioning editor of BBC Two at the time, rejected time and time and time again. And somehow I think Stephen Merchant was doing a production course, and they hired an office for a week and they filmed it and they did the pilot, and the commissioner still didn't want to show it, and then they showed it, and then it got so it kind of happened in spite of the system, and it made Ricky Gervais, and who, by the way, is in himself a great champion of free speech and all the things that you champion on this show. So there's something badly wrong with the system. Now I can give you some of the reasons why I think what I think is wrong with the system. Perhaps we'll come to that in a moment. But there's the other comment that I'd make is, if you look at what TV comedy is, very curated. What goes on TV is curated by some decision maker in commissioning. Yeah. And so what you see on telly is very different to what you see live. And if you look at what's going on in the live circuit and some of the clubs and some of the experimental nights, and we have Comedy Unleashed that we've all performed at many times, and there's many great cabaret nights and the Free Fringe up in Edinburgh. There's some really great stuff going on. So to say that comedy is bad or worse than it was, in many ways it's better than it's ever been. You just wouldn't know it by watching telly.
Right. I mean, do you find that too?
I think everybody's kind of got it exactly right here, because I think what Simon says is absolutely true, that I think in the last few years particularly, it hasn't just been about Brexit or Remain. I think it's more even whether you're woke or not. So, for example, I'm not right-wing, right, but I'm treated as if I'm right-wing in the industry because I'm simply not really woke and super left-wing. So it's become an industry which increasingly squeezes out people who are non-conformist, which is a very odd thing for comedy to be, because comedy is supposed to be the place where people who don't conform come together and create something. That's actually what comedy should be about. And if you think about the comedians that you respect throughout the years, right, these are people who would have pushed back against what the predominant narrative of that time was. I mean, Bill Hicks, who's one of my favorites, his last ever appearance on Letterman was actually not shown because it was considered too controversial, and it was shown 20 or 30 years later, and Letterman actually apologized to him posthumously because it wasn't actually that controversial. It was just controversial in that particular cultural moment. So I think that's right. And I also agree with Dominic. I think in terms of what's happening in the comedy circuit, we may very well be, in my opinion, on the very precipice of a new golden age of comedy. The question is, will you ever see that on TV in the next 5 years? That's a different conversation, because, as Dominic says, the people who seem to have their fingers on the control panel there, they're very keen to present a certain type of comedy and drive that certain type of comedy. A couple of days ago, a friend of mine who's a very famous musician, he was offered to do a show on a big TV channel in this country where he would learn stand-up and raise money for charity.
My brother-in-law is David Hay, the boxer, and he's been asked to do that as well.
Right. So my friend was offered this, and he said, yeah, great, I'd love to do it, but I'd love to do it with a comedian who's a friend of mine, so let's have Andrew Doyle or Konstantin. And they said, no, these people are not approved.
Seriously.
Yeah.
You're
So
officially not
it
approved.
could be that they've just seen my comedy. I don't know, but the point is that they knew who we were, but we were not approved, right? So there is an agenda there. And look, I'm not someone who ever complains about this stuff. I don't think it helps. And as someone who likes to challenge what the mainstream narrative is, I don't expect to be welcomed with open arms. I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think if you're going to challenge the mainstream, you should expect not to be necessarily liked by the mainstream. But I do think that definitely happens in TV, which is why I think Nick Cohen wrote a piece in Standpoint at the time we're recording this, saying that conservative comedy should be really good now because there's a lot to punch against, but it's not good.
And has he just not encountered it?
Well, that's my point.
Yeah.
That's exactly my point, because if you just watch TV, other than maybe Simon or Jeff Norcott, there's very few people who are not even conservative, who are just not super left or super woke that ever get through. So then the general public create that impression, and as rightly been said, that's a problem for the BBC in particular, which I actually think is a much needed institution if they can sort themselves out.
And it's a problem for the left, incidentally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the left, I mean, the Labour Party is fast trying to render itself unelectable, having learned all the wrong lessons apparently from 12th of December. It's now arguing itself into dust over issues that affect less than 1% of the population. You know, the definitions of transphobia and so on, and people being, it desperately needs to be satirised in order to wake itself up. I mean, you know, it's almost like the dynamic of playground bullying, which nobody wants to see ever, you know, escalate to the point where kids are in casualty. But there is a degree of enforcing social norms and letting kids know when they're wildly out of kilter, you know, which can be valuable. And that satire can produce that desired effect for the left as much as it can give succor to people on the right who are just exasperated.
Absolutely, and yet you will see, you and I both make jokes about Jeremy Corbyn at the time of the election. There was very few, if any, people making fun of that on TV. You
no
didn't see
enemy
any.
to the left.
Right, there's no satire of that kind at all. So there is an imbalance.
Yeah, and there's a very interesting lesson if you look at the early history of the Edinburgh Festival. And the Edinburgh Festival began in 1948. There was an Austrian Jewish refugee, a chap called Rudolf Bing, who wanted to put on a festival to heal the wounds of war through the medium of the arts. And he looked all around various places. He eventually decided on Edinburgh, and he raised £30,000 of subsidy. And he was going to put on the very cream of European and world art. So he put on Sadler's Wells Ballet, the Halle Orchestra, the Vienna Philharmonic, the Old Vic Theatre Group, all these great institutions of the arts. And he put the festival on, and there was a couple of local Scottish semi-amateur theatre groups, one quite left-wing Marxist group, and they applied to do this festival. And there was another puppeteer who also applied. And they were told they weren't good enough. And they were just, no, we only want the very best at this new festival. And they all these guys thought about it, and they just came anyway. They didn't get in the official brochure. They came, and they were known as the Uninvited Eight. And one of them the puppeteer put on a show in the foyer of the cinema. Another one found a disused restaurant. And there we saw the birth of the Edinburgh Fringe. And the following year, they were so successful, these uninvited guests, 12 of them came. And the year after that, 13. And it gradually grew and grew and grew. And by the mid to late 50s, the Fringe, it was only coined the Fringe by the mid-50s. The Fringe was outdoing the main festival to the extent that the main festival poached all the talent from a Fringe and put on this show with which they planned to kill the Fringe called Beyond the Fringe. The idea was it was a snub of the Fringe. Beyond the Fringe became a huge hit, and it only made the Fringe even more popular. And this went on and on and on to the extent that now the Fringe dwarfs the main festival. In fact, the main festival, to save itself, has had to merge with the Fringe. Now, the main festival is like the BBC. It's got some guy who knows better than you choosing what you watch. Whereas the Fringe, anyone can go. I decide if I'm going to go, not you. And I decide if my show's what I'm capable of doing, not you. And so on. And, it's the difference between YouTube, where anyone can put stuff on. And, what commissioner would ever have known that cat videos would become a thing or whatever it is? And yet, that's why the Fringe is so exciting. Then the Fringe began to kill itself, became subsidy and became uneconomic. And the market reacted quite efficiently and gave birth to this thing called the Free Fringe, which is like the most creative place on earth, possibly. And so the market has found solutions. The problem with television is that it is owned by a few curators, and it's very difficult, if you don't tick the right boxes, to get through the curators.
You're absolutely right, and I think this is why the future for comedy is looking very bright, as long as it's being consumed in different ways. I mean, I'm a great fan of Bill Burr in America. I think he's the best comedian out there. He's the comedian's comedian, and he actually doesn't like to get called into the debates about woke issues, because he says, I don't need the approval of the woke brigade, because his career doesn't depend on television. He sells out to huge audiences, and he has Netflix shows, and his Netflix shows are hugely popular around the world. So when he comes to London, he can sell out the Royal Albert Hall on repeated nights, even though he's never had any exposure on television in this country. And I think that's the model comedians here need to use, bypass to the BBC, because you have to ask yourself, which of those BBC comedians that we see every week would flourish if there were no BBC, or would they flounder? And I don't think Nish Kumar et al. Would be doing much apart from university campuses if they were actually free of the BBC. And all the comedians who actually are popular would avoid university campuses for the precise reason that their comedy would fall flat there. So I think, yes, comedy has a great future ahead, and it's things like Netflix and YouTube that are going to basically be the savers.
Netflix is interesting in that point of view. They have put on Bill Burr, and they put on Dave Chappelle, who's also defiantly anti-woke, and they've also put on Hannah Gadsby with Nanette, which was the single most woke sort of anti-comedy almost. I mean, it was quite explicitly anti-comedy. She basically spends an hour regretting that she has attempted to diffuse the tension surrounding her own sexual orientation through the use of comedy for her. It's not my kind of show, but she sold out the Sydney Opera House where it was recorded. Bill Burr recorded his Netflix special at the Royal Albert Hall in London, despite, as you say, being an American comedian with no access to BBC. So word is getting out. If you're a good comedian, Bill Burr is a very talented comedian. I mean, it's not easy to just go against the woke grain and be big. You've got to be funny. You've got to be great.
But I have to say,
sorry, I just want to interrupt you because it's interesting. I think the BBC has always been curated and has always had gatekeepers. And back in the day when they had the monopoly before YouTube or whatever, it still had gatekeepers, but they were of a very different mindset. A lot of the people who, for instance, commissioned, John Cleese and the Monty Python or the Frost Report had been at university with them, and then they get a job in the BBC and they go, "There's this chap Cleese, awfully funny. I think we should get him and his friend." And so you get now. A lot of people would regard that as, irredeemably, just obviously, on the face of it, morally bankrupt way to run a TV network, and yet it created extraordinary, genius that will stand the test of time. Yeah. Whereas now a far more egalitarian approach is, and actually they would probably argue that they are not gatekeepers in that traditional sense, that is much more like a set of algorithms that sort of decide
there was less competition in those days, wasn't there, to get on.
Yeah, but they have said, I think a couple of years ago, the controller of comedy said, well, we wouldn't make Monty Python now. They're a bunch of white boys from Oxbridge.
So and they won't get on now.
And
so
the
even if they're
that
extraordinary
talent, we need more woke comedy. So there is an agenda there. But look, the point that Simon makes about Hannah Gadsby, I think, is an important one, because none of us are saying, look, we need to shut down woke comedy. No one's saying that. What we're really saying is, look, we keep being told that we live in this society that's obsessed with diversity and inclusion. Brilliant. Let's have more diversity. If we have a huge political event like the Brexit referendum, let's have comedians who think it's a terrible idea. Brilliant. Let's have them on TV. Let them make their jokes. For some people, that's really funny. But if someone makes a song about Brexit, making light of the European Union, criticizing the EU, let's have that on as well. Let's have more diversity of thought.
Yeah. But what about the counterforce that's going on at the moment, which is this sort of woke culture that says, well, you can't offend anyone. Wasn't there? You were invited to SOAS, and they were saying, well, you can make jokes, but you have to fill out this form and say you'll be kind to everyone.
Yes, you have to be respectful and kind, and they had a list of about 20 things.
At which point comedy becomes impossible. So if that culture starts to take hold, doesn't that become a real threat? Is that?
Well, that's why I turned down the contract, because I think there are some people who are trying to move us in that direction, and of course students have always been a bit crazy in that way, particularly at SOAS, let's be honest. But my concern is that as any culture that comes from university will eventually seep out into broader society. So they're students today, but 10 years from now they're going to be Labour MPs, journalists, etc., and that's when they start to influence our society, and you can see that happening. So I think, but the point I'm making is I think all of us are not calling for other types of comedy to be shut down. We just want more variety of comedy to be shown on TV, and for people, if someone, Dominic, myself, Simon, Alistair Williams, a bunch of us have had viral videos of our clips of stand-up be seen by millions of people around the world and around the country. So there's demand for people to joke about Jeremy Corbyn or to joke about hating Brexit or whatever, but for some reason that's not being filtered through, and I think we need more of that.
And I think you're absolutely right. I was on I don't know if you know the Now Show, which is like a long-running Friday night topical comedy, and they did a Now Show Brexit special, which was on the Sunday before the Brexit vote in 2016. And it was hosted by Punt and Dennis, who are, liberal Oxbridge graduates, and they had their usual sort of suspects on there doing a liberal take on it. And then they had a debate about in which they wanted two comedians to go head to head, pro and against Brexit, and they got me in to do the pro Brexit one. And Ed Morris, who I wasn't a Brexit voter, I wasn't really a Remain voter either. I was like, I'm not sure, and it's interesting, but I didn't really think it was going to happen. Lucy Porter was who wasn't particularly energised about it, was the Remain. But the interesting thing was, I went on and I wrote these things out, and my big point was that there were questions like, what is it you've got to get against Europe? And I said, well, I think I refute the validity of the question. It's not what I've got against Europe, it's what have I got against unnecessary supranational systems of, extraneous tiers of organisation. And I've got my experience of that is running one in the sixth form block when I was at school. It's a racket. I know how these things work. And I did this stuff, and I said, yeah. Anyway, the point was, this was a Radio 4 audience, and they were the Now Show audience, and they're extremely left. But I got easily the biggest reaction on the night from the crowd, to the extent that I've always worried that I might have actually caused Brexit, because the response was so enlivening, because this crowd were desperate to hear the other side of the coin. All they'd heard for about 40 minutes was everyone just kind of basically, Farage is an idiot, and there's like a bunch of knuckle-dragging racists and so on. Somebody stood up and just made some really quite facetious, arguments in defence of Brexit. They were like, oh my God, it's like somebody opened a window, there's just a bit of fresh air. I think that, for me, proved the point, and yet the BBC certainly didn't seem to learn from it, because there's been no more.
They've given Jeff Norcott.
Yes,
he's had plenty of airtime, and Jeff's done fantastically well from it.
He has.
And every opportunity he's been given, he's been taken, because he's been very funny.
He's a very good comedian.
Yeah, absolutely, and Jeff's been very good for a very long time. But if you get into an argument with somebody at the BBC, and you'll go, this other side is not represented, and you will go, there's this programme, there's this programme, there's this programme. They're all clearly from that Remain worldview. And somebody who's trying to counter that will go, yes, but there's Jeff Norcott.
Yeah,
but Jeff is like one guy who occasionally appears for a couple of minutes on one programme.
And almost like Sooty, to be honest, isn't he? So, what's that, Jeff Norcott?
Exactly.
You think Jeremy Corbyn did it? I mean, he's very funny. He's a great joke writer, but he's not really providing any.
And if you look at the way that he's always introduced on the MASH report, it's the Conservative voice of Britain. It's like a freak show. Let's wheel on this exceptional creature that we've managed to find in the wild. In the jungle, and whereas in fact we know that 50% plus one of the population actually side with him. He's made to look as if he's the anomaly.
And Jeff is like, he's a white sort of working class guy. He describes his dad as Mondeo man. He's as typical an English person as you could get.
He's a classic 80s Tory, isn't he? Well,
this is why it's so
and even he struggles on Mock the Week. I've seen him, have moments. I mean, he's been and gone now, and Mock the Week is probably on its downward trajectory now anyway. But I've seen, and he's talked about, basically you do a joke which has an underlying right-wing sentiment on Mock the Week, and the air is sucked out of the room, because they create such a strong momentum in a certain direction that you can't just turn that around. It's more like you've gone what's he going with that?
And Ray's point is why this whole situation is so unsustainable, because what you're really talking about is the fact that the majority of the country are not being served by the comedy that they're being forced to watch, and that's why we have the conversation about the BBC license fee, because the comedy thing is replicated elsewhere. It's replicated in the news side of it, in the other parts of entertainment.
I think actually, I'd say BBC News, I think, is pretty well balanced personally. In fact, it may even have a slight right-wing balance. I'm not saying it does, but it may do. I can see the argument argument for that. I think their drama department is. I think it's like anthropology. I mean, it's so riddled with over politicized.
It's been infected.
Well, with all these things, the marketplace should decide everything at the end of the
coronavirus.
day. And I think YouTube would be an excellent way to test and see how many views will BBC comedians get versus those who never appeared on the BBC, and that would be a very good way to sort of analyse.
It would, but there's one thing about the BBC. It is the most, even now, it is the most fantastic platform. And you know, I can sit here moaning about, you know, this structurally is wrong and curation and all the rest of it. But for example, when I wrote my book is sort of consistently, you know, 2,000 to 3,000 in the bestseller list. And then I went on Radio 4 Start the Week, and suddenly it went up to 200.
Wow.
And it just goes and then stayed there for a week, and then went back to its sort of natural place in the sort of 2,000 to 3,000 range. So
Return to ignominy.
But that's actually pretty good. That's pretty good for a hardback. But the point is, if like, you know, you get some comics who they get a spot on Mock the Week and they're very funny in it, and suddenly their tour sells out.
Can I
it
tell
really
you one
is the most wonderful
example
platform.
was Top Gear. Now, Top Gear was the most profitable. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't, but I think it was the most profitable worldwide sales show. It's not a comedy show per se. In fact, it'd be hard to say exactly what it was. But I know several people who worked in television, all of whom acknowledged it was a work of genius. The production, the structure, the presenters were kind of clunky, and Clarkson in his dad jeans and everything were a bit kind of
full of humour.
You were like, God, it's dad jokes, but it had this kind of life. It just had this vitality. It wasn't my cup of tea at all. I have to say, I would occasionally go on walking holidays with my mates, and we'd end up watching it in the cottage in the evening, and I would be going, oh God, really? You know, you they want to watch whether a Toyota can drive through this river. But it had something that really appealed to masses of people. Clearly, no show in my lifetime has angered the left so much as that show. It infuriated them. A couple of slightly off-colour jokes, one of which, yes, I can see there was one joke that was a bit racist and should probably have been edited out. That, you know, gradually this momentum builds, we've got to get it, and then Clarkson punches a producer. Now that was obviously a massive misjudgment on his part, but if the sentiment had been there, if the will had been there to save him and turn him around and get him to make the abject apology and go on some sort of course about not punching producers, it would have been possible to save that show, instead of which they leapt on it. It was gone almost overnight. It was like what they did to Scruton, you know, it was like this is the final straw. And you're going, where are the other straws? There have been 2 other straws in a show that is making you millions worldwide. And so they left, and now I don't know how well, I don't follow this stuff, how well it's doing on Amazon, or indeed I know the follow-up shows really struggle. But it was the determination of the left that there could not be a show on the BBC which was essentially that mindset writ large and doing well, and you know, if these blokes want to watch Match of the Day, we can't stop them, because, you know, but that's it, and that's all they get.
There is this really, I'm going to call it what it is this evil thing, and it's worse on the left than it is anywhere else, of wanting to no platform anyone who expresses an opinion that you don't like. And so it happened with Top Gear, it happened with Scruton, even you know, if I get on Radio 4 just to talk about my book, there's 100 people, why is the BBC giving this right-wing shrill a platform? And it's why is it that the people on the other side of the argument never feel the need to no platform the left, or is that
well,
it's an interesting.
We think they're wrong, and they think we're evil.
Well, they did in the 1960s in America, but it is extraordinary how
You're
they
talking
don't
about
seem
McCarthyism.
but they don't seem to have drawn that parallel. But we are we're closing in on that now, I think. You know,
Well, and if you think
this
about
is new
the
McCarthyism.
80s and 90s, it was in America the religious right. That's why the comedians of that period, you know, the Carlins and the Hickses, they would push back against religion, which is why you don't see anyone talking about religion, right? So, but I think in terms of what we're talking about, what you were talking about particularly, there's an interesting double standard when it comes to offensive jokes, because there are a number of comedians who've been on the BBC for a very long time who've been making incredibly offensive jokes. You know, Frankie Boyle talking about a celebrity's disabled son in a very kind of disparaging way, and that's all fine as long as politically you're in the right place, just like you're talking about Top Gear, right? Those offensive jokes are fine. Whereas if someone who is not left-wing, or worse, even right-wing, were to do those same jokes, then instantly they're punching down and they're terrible. So I think that interpretation of people's behavior is very dependent on where they're seen as being politically.
Well, Frankie Boyle's an interesting case, because he was offensive up until 2010. He was punching down in 2010. Suddenly, 2010, that was the time you had the coalition government coming in, but that's also when you had Russell Brand and Jonathan Ross, who had to resign from the BBC over their call to Andrew Sachs. And there was a sea change that happened in comedy at that time. People don't realise that. Comedy became more bland after Frankie Boyle. I mean, Mock the Week, for example, he never goes back onto Mock the Week now. He was the reason people watched Mock the Week. There's been this cleaning up, this puritanical wokeness has come through comedy since 2010, and I don't see people commenting on that much. And that's when you see things on Have I Got News For You? Everything changed in the last 10 years and became more bland, more saccharine. You can only make fun of Tories or people who are privileged. You can't even make fun of Meghan and Harry, despite the fact that that's punching up, clearly.
That was extraordinary,
they're now a oppressed minority.
The Meghan thing does seem to have brought it into extraordinarily sharp relief, even more than Brexit. You've got a bloke on Question Time who's accused of abusing his privilege for criticising a princess, an actual princess. I mean, it's like, how much more absurd? I mean, yes, he's born into an acting family and he's probably had a couple of jobs that he might have otherwise not have got, but he's not. I mean, I'd never heard of him beforehand, so he hasn't had that much privilege, you know.
The Fox
he's a
dynasty
mate of
isn't
yours,
the Windsor
isn't he? You know, exactly,
But I mean, this stuff is very powerful. I mean, and I mean, there have been cases out in the population, haven't there, where like someone just retweets on social media or on their Facebook or something a comedian's routine, and then suddenly the police are knocking at their door, or they're getting fired from their work.
The bloke at Asda who got sacked for posting a clip from a DVD they sell in Asda. They actually sell the DVD.
To name drop, I was having drinks with Jim Davison's son last night, who said that his dad was brought up before the as a hate crime for comments he made at his own birthday party, which someone recorded, and he ended up having a hate incident alleged, which didn't go any further. But that just shows you now, not even your own birthday party is free.
But all those guys, the comedians of the 70s, were basically no platformed by the Alexi Sale, Ben Elton, that generation, all those, the Jim Davidsons and even Benny Hill and all those guys, and commissioners were actually scared to commission. You know, they didn't want to be, even though, you know, Jim Davidson was excellent on the Generation Game, and he was the only guy who was as good as Bruce Forsyth was, and Benny Hill got the viewers in.
Larry Grayson was pretty good.
Did Larry? I take that back. I was thinking of the latter.
But no, he
evolution.
was. I mean, he did function.
But he, you know, and he's, you know, and a lot of that stuff. If you judge the stuff that came out in the 70s by the standards of today, then of course it's unacceptable. But standards change with time.
There was a thing, wasn't there, where there was a sort of default, like, none of these guys are okay anymore.
They were all
and then, one by one, some of them, like Les Dawson, were kind of reviewed and allowed back in. But the idea was...
Two Ronnies sort of survived. Even if you watch some... We all think we love the Two Ronnies. You watch some of the Two Ronnies stuff now, and you're like, oh,
I know.
crikey.
Funny enough, I was talking about this here. I checked into a travel lodge, and they had the TV tuned to one of those channels where it's just like old Two Ronnies in the evening, and instead of being the best of the Two Ronnies, you saw what an average Two Ronnies show was like, and you were like, oh my god, it's really like.
But you know, you guys, I'm a bit younger than you guys, and what I notice incredible to me is actually it's much later shows that now are completely beyond the pale. So, for example, Harry Hill and what was it called, Harry and
Meghan.
No, very good. Harry and Paul.
Oh yeah,
Harry and Paul. You watch some of that stuff. It was Harry Enfield. Harry and Paul. They did.
They are quite edgy. Actually.
They are edgy.
But that was like 10 years ago.
Yeah,
but
it wasn't 30 years ago.
Friends
is problematic now.
Trying to ban Friends or something.
Come Fly With Me. Right. Come Fly With Me was a great comedy written by David Walliams and the other chap from Little Britain. And there they were, you know, dressing up in blackface as Shirley Bassey and as this big, large black woman. It was great comedy, but of course now they've had to apologise for something made within the last decade. That's how quickly things change and how the young eat their own. You know? But we have to celebrate the BBC too, because we have to remember the BBC gave us the golden age of comedy. The BBC was the driving force that nurtured comedy, so let's not be too harsh. What we need is another Bill Cotton. You know, he was in charge of light entertainment. He gave us everything that we had in the 70s and the 80s. In the 90s, we had David Rennick, you know, fantastic writer, One Foot in the Grave. I mean, there's such great comedies that were put out. I mean, ITV only gave us Rising Damp, really. That was the only comedy. Everything else was done on the BBC.
Yeah,
so we
but
need
there's
to
another
celebrate
reason.
them and bring them back
There's
on.
another reason that so much was on the BBC. They repeated their stuff, and ITV never did. So there are great shows that were on ITV that never got repeated and have been forgotten.
But interesting, the
lost.
BBC hasn't repeated Python that much. They've always been a bit.
They
a bit
used to.
weird. They used to.
They used to.
Yeah.
But they
Well, there's a
didn't.
whole
So
scene
like
of
40
trans rights in
towns.
there now that you would.
But if you look at, like, I can talk about. I mean, if you want, I can tell you unknown ITV sitcoms if you want, because I've sort of done
Up
a
the
bit of stuff.
elephant around the castle.
There was one called Lucky
I remember
Fella,
that one.
which starred David Jason as one of two Cockney brothers living in a council flat set in Brockley, not in
Wow.
Peckham, in Brockley. Only David Jason was the stupid one, and they drove around in a stupid three-wheeler car.
No.
And watch it. It
Really?
was just the template for Only
Wow.
Fools and Horses.
Yeah.
The template. And but it was only ever shown once. And if you look at the viewing figures that Fawlty Towers got, first series of Fawlty, there was only ever 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers.
That's right.
And the first series was repeated 4 times, and the viewing figures went 1.5 million, 3 million, 6 million, 12 million.
Yeah.
So it
I
was
think
the
that
repeated
happened with
things.
The Office to some extent.
Yes,
as
it
well.
did,
Yeah.
and that's that. When the BBC champions something and repeats it, and that's when it becomes.
Well, they still
well known.
repeat Dad's Army, don't
Yeah.
they? Quite a lot.
But you know, ideologically in principle, I'm a big fan of the BBC. I actually think it's great to have a national institution that people from both sides can come together and watch. The problem we've had in recent years, as we've been talking about ad nauseum, is that it's become increasingly directed at a certain sliver of society. And if it can get back to having a general plurality of thought, plurality of comedy, plurality of drama, all those things, I actually think it could be a huge benefit to this country. You know, my grandfather, when he escaped the Soviet Union, one of his biggest crimes was listening to the BBC. It was a voice of freedom to people. So the BBC can be a
Radio
force.
2.
It was BBC World Service.
But actually, what I think one of the problems with BBC and TV production is like, what happens when you start out in your 20s as a comic? Maybe I actually started when I was 27, but you start out, and there's always loads of you doing open spots, and it's just the natural way of things that not everyone can earn a living. There aren't enough gigs for everyone who starts out to earn a living. Maybe there were in the 60s or 70s or something, but there just aren't now. And so you just see people falling off the wayside. And so, particularly on the club circuit, where it's the quickest way to earning a living, you have to be, you just have to be pretty good to earn a living in the clubs. And so what you tend to find is a lot of guys who just can't quite hack it, or they go and just do Edinburgh shows every year without doing the regular circuit, at which point they become more interesting in Edinburgh because you're like, oh, well, I can see that guy on the club circuit, and they go and see him in Edinburgh. But a lot of them just go, they don't make it as a writer performer, and so they go and work in TV, which is the kind of next best thing. So a lot of the TV hierarchy is filled with people who weren't good enough to make it. Do you see what I mean? So there's this sort of inherent second best. I hope nobody in TV actually hears me say that.
I was going to say you'll never get back on TV ever.
I don't know whether the figures would stack up, but you can see why somebody might want to do that.
Yeah.
Certainly.
But I mean, I think we sort of agreed that the comedy's lively out there. The problem is getting it onto the BBC, and however much you can do now with new media, the BBC still has a big role to play. But I mean, as we sort of wrap this discussion up, I mean, how optimistic should we be? Is it hopeless? Is it just going to fall away over time? Is there something we should be doing? What's people's sense?
Well, I think what Rafe said about Netflix is encouraging, in that the BBC will, whether or not it does go to subscription or whatever, the BBC will have to look at other models which have found better, more successful means of delivering to a wider range of audience. And if you simply just allow, as much as it's not out of the question, even if it remains on its current funding, that it could allow a certain amount of awareness of market forces, to whether it be clicks and likes or whatever, to just encourage it to be a little bit more. It doesn't even really need. It's not like you're looking for right-wing comedians. And to be honest, I wouldn't expect to see Jim Davison on there, who has become kind of pugnaciously right-wing and inappropriate, and
Sure.
And I completely understand why they wouldn't put him on. But just stuff that isn't actually shoving woke politics down your throat all the time, just stuff that is funny in kind of examination of family life or whatever. It will discover that, I think.
I'd love to be the next Director General of the BBC, because what I would do.
It's been an unusual pitch from that point of view.
I don't think I'm going to get the gig for various reasons. But the opportunity, from an investment point of view, the opportunity that is the BBC and the worldwide reputation it has and the perception it has, I would focus on making British programmes for British people, but I would open up the market through iPlayer and through the various other means you can, so that people from abroad can subscribe. And there's all sorts of copyright issues with BBC Worldwide and the way they sell programmes that they can't do it. But crikey, see, you can, if you want to enough. And you could just make so much money opening the BBC up to a worldwide audience, making British programmes for British people, that you would have to charge neither a licence fee nor a subscription. It could be free.
But you're going to have to hold your nose and make Top Gear again. You know?
So what?
People I agree
that's why I said British programmes for British people. That's what they'll have to do. Because British people wanted it was made by Brits for Brits, and the world loved it. And that's what we have to get back to, instead of, you know, making stuff that people... And often it is the forces of commerce, it's market forces that force you to do that. And so maybe it needs to be opened up to market forces so it becomes less protectionist.
You can tell he's a libertarian, can't you? I think actually incredibly optimistic I am about the future of comedy. Like I said at the beginning, I think we are on the verge of a new alternative comedy, and I see that with Comedy Unleashed, which Dominic mentioned, where he hosts often and we perform. I see that there's a hunger for a counterculture, and I think that is now being formed. And with the internet, as Rafe said, YouTube and Netflix, I think, is still a form of gatekeeping, if you like. But certainly with YouTube, there is an opportunity for people who are funny, but who are not welcome in the mainstream channels, to develop an audience, to become known, and then to be able to perform. And then, as you say, market forces in the end will take over.
Rafe, last thoughts?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think certainly we've got Netflix, but there's a proliferation of other channels that are coming out onto the internet. Why not have one just for comedy? For the UK, dealing with stand-up comics, so people can go there and they know that they're going to have a wide diversity of opinion.
It's called
on
Dave.
on this platform. Well, if you want to look at how you looked 10 years ago, it's called Dave.
I would say, though, it's stand-up comedy. I mean, when it was funny, it was my agent, sadly deceased now, who created Live. It was originally Jack D at the Apollo, and then Michael McIntyre's Roadshow, both with a huge bank of electric lights behind them in a massive stage, revolutionised how we consume stand-up on telly. It's still nothing like as good as going to a gig. Right. You really need to go out and see it live. You need to smell it and spill the beer, and then it really becomes alive. I think finding new formats through which funny people can reach an audience through television is an ongoing, and it does feel to me like we are due a new, the panel game era was like 20 years or so we've had of like, have I got news for you, and then all its wannabes. I feel like now, actually, if you watch some of the great American podcasts, which get millions of views, people like Joe Rogan will have Bill Burr on, and they will spend 3 hours just chewing the fat and maybe smoking a joint, whatever, and they go here, there, and everywhere, and there are no limitations at all. A lot of people really like those shows. That might give us some kind of indication of where it could go. Feel like we're due a new format.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the two leading podcasts in America are both done by comedians, Dave Rubin and Joe Rogan, who will have on Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray and others onto his show, because stand-up comedians see the potential here, and of course in America they're great defenders of free speech. But you're bang on the nail about opening up the BBC to the world, because we are one of the world's top-ranked soft power nations. Our reach, we punch far above our weight because of our soft power. The BBC is one of the ways to do that, and it's a crying shame that people around the world, or even we, can't watch the BBC when we travel abroad. It's absolute nonsense. And you've got to realise that we're regarded as the world's funniest nation, but we've only got fumes left in the tank right now, and it's 40 Towers and Benny Hill that are constantly, and Are You Being Served, of all things, in America that keep being cited. We need to get out there and push BBC, especially in this era of Brexit, we're promoting the best of British. Let's use the BBC to channel that soft power and give Britain a big boost.
Well, on that optimistic note, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to all of my guests, and thank you for listening. This has been Counterculture.